Okay, without further ado, I think we're just gonna jump into my favorite content creator ever. This time for real. This time for real. My inspiration. My I don't know. My I don't have the word. I don't have a word to describe just how much that man means to me. So many emotions. It's been so long since we first interacted. I look fondly to our exchanged messages, and although lately we've not been talking as much, so I have to do something to change that. Hopefully. Hopefully. So, where's the video? Yes, unfortunately, he's been very silent to me recently, and I just feel like I feel neglected. You all know who I'm talking about, right? You all know, yeah. Nobody knows? It's okay. I'm gonna show you in a moment. It's a very prominent face. Beautiful face. Is he gonna show up? Yay! Beautiful. Beautiful. My idol. Even if my idol has not been speaking to me as much lately. Wow. Okay. It's been so long since we've touched anything of his. Ow! 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 God damn it! God damn it! Ouch! Oh. Ow! What's happening? What is happening to me? I promised I'd be serious. I promised I'd be serious. And already, I'm starting this segment with clownery. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. The anime avatar might be gone, but at the heart of hearts, I'm still clowning around. Oh, it's okay. I'm gonna put on my pink thing. Yeah, that's right. When I did my famous reaction to BadEmpanada, I still only used the avatar. I was a VTuber, and my voice was different as well. So a lot has changed. I'm a different person now. I have grown, both as a human and as a creator. So I thought we would revisit the topic of the Holodomor and watch a BadEmpanada reaction to a person that debunks him. So I'm gonna do a reaction to a reaction to a reaction. Let's go. It's time. It has been far too long. Now I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm gonna have a book here, because I think just one book is enough for me to sort of fall on when it comes to this. A book that BadEmpanada probably does not accept, but it smells nice, so I will accept it. Hello, content sniffer. Hello, content sniffer. I see you've sniffed the content. It's been so long since you've been here. Is it because of Are you here because of BadEmpanada? Content sniffer. Have you seen me without the avatar? I actually wonder now if Content Sniffer was last year when I was still a VTuber or not. Actually wondering. But yes. We're gonna be using Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder as our source today. Listen, my reaction to BadEmpanada's Holodomor video is like, hello. Holodomor, do you also have happy topics from time to time? Also, hi. Yes, sometimes. But I'm Polish, so it's not a rule. My rule is to stay to sad topics because I'm Polish. Also, my reaction to BadEmpanada's Holodomor video to this day is my most successful video view-wise, so it's like over 5,000. I'm not really sure what BadEmpanada is. Well then, you're in luck, you're about to learn. I'm not gonna say anything because I don't want to poison the well. So you just have to experience his glory on your own by watching me react to him. I will not say a word. You just have to learn who he is through his own words and actions. Is it gonna play?
Hello, my friends. So
see? Hello, my friends. So right off the bat, we know that BadEmpanada is an extremely friendly person. Because right off the bat, he said, hello, my friends. So he treats us as friends. See? There we go. You don't know what BadEmpanada is. Now you're learning. You've learned your first fact about BadEmpanada. BadEmpanada is a friendly person. Hello, friends. See? Sometimes you don't know anything about a person, and bit by bit, you sort of discover.
So this is a glorious...
Held the name in one of the Cuffles takedowns all the time. Oh.
Day. It is a truly, truly glorious occasion because someone has finally made a real effort at responding to one of my videos.
That is wonderful. But also I have to point out that the way you said it, it also sounds a bit sad. Because you're also making it sound like you don't feel you're worthy of your videos being responded to. Or rather, you're making it sound like nobody actually wants to respond to your videos. Which, there might be several reasons for that. Maybe they don't feel confident enough. Or maybe they just don't think it's worth their while. Both possibilities are equally plausible. I'll just say that. Maybe they just don't feel confident because you've laid your claim. You've made your point so well. You've stated your case in such great detail that there was just nothing to respond to. The video is perfect and all people can do is enjoy it in silence without further elaboration. Or they just think it's not worth responding to. Both of these are equally plausible.
Okay, so calling it a real effort might be giving them a bit too much credit, but I don't really care. I'm just so excited here because I don't usually get video responses.
Damn.
Seems that
I know BadEmpanada responded to my video, so I do get video responses from BadEmpanada.
most people are too intimidated to even try, so I'm just happy that someone's given it a go, finally.
Oh, intimidated. Well, you got me there. I've not thought of that possibility of people being intimidated. You got me there.
So to celebrate this momentous occasion, I'm going to respond to that response. Naturally. Now, I've pre-watched it and I've decided pretty conclusively it's not the sort of response that really requires me to go back and do new research or write a script or anything, because the creator doesn't really counter any of my arguments. He doesn't really provide...
Well, that's convenient. Okay, let's go then.
Counter evidence. He basically just sort of talks really smugly.
Although I think that you should just... I don't know. I think you could skip this and just get to the point, but... I guess different creators have different styles, and you're a lot bigger than me, so maybe I'm the one that does not understand how this whole thing works.
And ignores the vast majority of my video to selectively choose parts of it to
This feels
respond
like
to,
filler.
which I'm not going to do to him. I'm going to show his entire video as I respond to it part by part.
Okay.
So yeah, just a bit of courtesy for you, my friend. So he's responding to...
See? Okay, we've learned another thing. We've learned a BadEmpanada thing number 2. A BadEmpanada fact. The first one was BadEmpanada is friendly. The second BadEmpanada fact is that BadEmpanada is courteous. Just a bit of courtesy for you, my friend. So friendly and courteous. Which is lovely, isn't it? So far, so good. So far, BadEmpanada feels like a very lovely and likable individual. Yes, out and proud trans women are just past the point of being intimidated by almost anything, considering how intimidating coming out tends to be. True. That is true.
to my video on the Holodomor genocide question, which is the historical debate as to whether or not the Holodomor constitutes a genocide.
Friendly and courteous seems great. I know. Which is why we're going to very respectfully and very calmly respond to this video. I know, last time I not only had the anime avatar, I had a much more squeaky-ish voice, like this. And I also showed great disrespect to BadEmpanada by playing Doom. But don't worry, this time there won't be no Doom. No Dooms will be played during this reaction. This video will have my full attention, my full concentration. All of my faculties will be engaged. So don't worry. Don't worry.
And my video was framed as
I'm a new person, a totally different streamer.
A response to the Wikipedia article on the topic at the time. So he begins his video by fundamentally agreeing with what I say at the beginning of my video, which is like a 6 to 7 minute short.
I think Wikipedia can be a good entry, but I think you need more. I think you need more sources, preferably, depending on the topic. Primary sources, some good books from reputable authors, like The Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder would be a good example.
Sort of explanation on why you should be sort of skeptical of Wikipedia when it's dealing with like a...
I mean, you probably shouldn't use it as your only source. That I can agree with. You probably shouldn't be saying, I read the Wikipedia, so I guess I'm good. I don't have to read anything else to know about this topic. That is something that I can on board.
Topic of any sort of political contention. So I'm going to skip the part where he's agreeing with me and get to the first part where he disagrees with me. And from there, I'm going to show every little part of his video and respond bit by bit to everything that he says, which is how you do a real thorough counter argument.
Exactly.
Take notes. So let's begin.
Exactly. Take notes. So the first thing was being friendly. The second one was being courteous. And the third one is being diligent. Take notes. He encourages you to be diligent, just like he is. Take notes. Which I found to be a very lovely, very friendly, again, and very helpful advice. It is always worthy to take notes. Oh, okay, you're a head mod for food shops. Interesting. I didn't know that. But you watched me before. You came to my streams before food shops even started streaming or something, from what I recall. I certainly met you before food shops. There were evaluations of its quality 15 years ago, and the German Wikipedia was already outperforming the most well-respected German general encyclopedia. Okay. That is fair. I think the quality of Wikipedia is usually massively underestimated. It's not perfect, but many other individual sources are even worse. Well, I think it just shouldn't be used as a sole source, as the only source. I think it's not a bad source, but it's not the. I think it's an entry point to many topics rather than.
Here's the first part where he has a bit of contention with my Holodomor video.
The reasoning he uses to debunk the article is very similar to the flawed, irrelevant reasoning that we.
Oh wow. BadEmpanada is so unlucky. First debunked by an anime avatar, me, and then debunked by a cartoon, an iCartoon. So unlucky. Well, don't worry. Now you're being responded to by a full-fleshed trans woman. Without the avatar, even though remnants are still present here in the form of these two animated GIFs, which you have to forgive me for. I'm sorry. But at least I'm not playing Doom. So I suppose that is an improvement, right?
Wikipedia uses to decide what is and what isn't a reliable source, in that he makes several arguments against a side claiming it was a genocide that have nothing to do with whether or not it was a genocide, and little to do with the actual data itself. There are a lot of pedantic arguments he presents in his hour and a half, so I will just focus on the one.
Pedantic arguments. Maybe. We all like to be pedantic from time to time, so don't be nitpicky with pedantic. Sometimes something that you think is just pedantic can be a crucial piece of information without which you wouldn't understand the context of what is being talked about. So you have to be careful with levying the accusation of people being quote-unquote pedantic is what I'm...
Ones that stand out the most. But for the most part, I found his video to be guilty of something I
should say Roma. Well, if you want to get that conversation, then you have to go to Chad Logic's chat and remind him that he promised me a debate and just run away from it. I'm still happy to have that conversation with him about the Irish travelers. Hello. I'm still happy to have that conversation. That is all up to him, if he has the courage to do it.
like to call source midwittery, which is when a scholar's analysis that is being used as a source is getting judged based on some random irrelevant nitpicks. For example, he explains why countries recognizing the Holodomor as a genocide doesn't automatically make it a genocide because governments tend to just adopt what truth is convenient to them.
I mean, okay, I'm actually gonna address this in a moment. This whole countries recognizing what is and what isn't genocide. Because, okay, let's...
regardless of evidence.
As what term did you use here?
Now, get a genocide because explains why countries recognize is getting judged source midwittery, which is when a scholar's analysis that is being used as a source is getting judged based on some random...
I mean... source?
irrelevant nitpick. Scholar's analysis found his video to be guilty of something I like to call source midwittery, which is when a scholar's analysis that is being used as a source...
scholar's analysis that is being used as a source. But states are not scholars. States are states, so...
is getting judged based on some random irrelevant nitpicks. For example, he explains...
yeah, states are not scholars. States are not scholarly sources. States are governmental bodies, political bodies. They're not scholars per se. They can use the help of scholars. They can certainly take the advice and counsel of scholars, but typically governments themselves are not made of scholars.
Why countries recognizing the Holodomor as a genocide doesn't automatically make it a genocide because governments tend to just adopt what truth is convenient to them, regardless of evidence. Now, to be fair, this is somewhat half true.
This is actually completely true. Countries recognizing or not recognizing something to be genocide do not... it does not necessarily speak to whether or not something is genocide or not. It works both ways. Just because a country recognizes something as genocide, it doesn't mean that it's factually one. But also, just because a country doesn't recognize something as genocide, it doesn't also automatically mean that no genocide occurred. And there are many examples of countries that deny that a genocide has occurred, when we have reasons to be doubtful of that claim. Like when Germany for the longest time said that the South Western Africa genocide of the Nama and Herero people was not a genocide, when it was pretty well documented that it was. And only recently Germany has decided to openly admit that it has committed one, and even started speaking about some form of reparation. And of course, we have the USSR and then Russia that also denies committing a pretty well documented genocide, the Katyn massacre. It actually, Russia goes even further than denying that it's a genocide. Russia actually even denies that it was manslaughter. And then we have Russia claiming still that Ukraine has committed genocide against Russian speakers in the Donbass, right? See, just because a state says that a genocide has been committed or not, it does not speak to whether or not there actually was a genocide or not. That is definitely, it's not just half true. It's just true. And of course, there is the fact that different countries have access to different types of information. Like Poland will have certain information on the Great Hunger in Ukraine that other countries might not, because Western Ukraine used to be within the borders of Poland, and also Poland actually had many spies in the USSR. So, of course, it will have more sources relating to the Holodomor than, let's say, Australia, for example.
There are some lies governments can get away with telling and some that they can't, and they usually do tend to say the things that benefit them the most.
I mean, with the topic of genocide, it gets a little bit more complicated than that. It gets complicated. Countries really do not want to implicate themselves when it comes to genocide. Like, that is why the US was so slow to actually sort of ratify the Genocide Convention to begin with. The US did not ratify the convention during the life of Rafał Lemkin because it was afraid it would implicate itself, that some light would be shined on the the things that the US has been doing, and that it would not be good. For the same reason, the USSR also pushed to remove social and political groups from the UN definition of genocide, because that would surely lead to trouble when it comes to what the USSR has been doing historically with its population, and so on and so forth. Don't say that. We've already learned today that BadEmpanada is friendly, courteous, and diligent. But yes, hello Andreas Werbel CH. We're doing a react to BadEmpanada. I'm trying to recreate my most successful video. I'm trying to recreate my success.
But that's a completely different topic altogether. Rather, this reasoning becomes a problem because he argues that the Ukrainian government calling it a genocide can't be taken seriously, but for some reason scholars...
If it was the government alone, then I would agree, but I think there are many scholars, Ukrainian scholars, that also agree with that, unless you say that Ukrainian scholars have some sort of bias as well, but that is not really the standard that we take when it comes to historians. We don't say that historians from a given country cannot speak on the history of their own countries. Yeah, one in Palestine that almost no one acknowledges. I mean, there is an ongoing case for that, for the Palestinian one. Keep in mind. To some extent, there is also the question whether it matters whether I get killed in a genocide or in an unjustified mass slaughter. That is not a genocide. The end result is still the same. For an individual, yes, but for a group, the result will be different. The result of a mass killing will be different than the result of a genocide in many cases. Because the goal, what matters is the goal, as I often say. And as I've said in a debate that I had with food shops,
who cite Soviet state propaganda should be taken seriously. And this is just a general problem you often see with commie logic. If the source is data from a socialist state, then it is to be
commie logic, damn, so aggressive. What's wrong with communism?
accepted without question, but if the source comes from a non-socialist state, then it's evil, imperious Nazi propaganda or something. This is one of the
That statement is actually really weird now that I think about it. Russia is not a socialist state. And technically speaking, during the USSR, both Russia and Ukraine were socialist states. So I'm not sure what this necessarily means.
the many reasons why talking to communists often feels like you're talking to a wall.
I just want to interject here. Which scholars are you talking about exactly who take commie Soviet propaganda at face value? Could you name them? Because you don't seem to actually provide an example for your claim here. One of the things that I do, and that I think anyone should do, is provide an actual example when they claim something. If I am supposedly citing scholars who just take Soviet commie propaganda or whatever at face value, I would expect you to say, for example, he did that here with this scholar who took this propaganda at face value.
True, but they were socialist under the understanding of the Soviet bloc. I will say that. I will use that term in this sense. I know it wasn't socialist in the actual socialist sense of the word. I'm saying socialist in the Soviet Eastern Bloc meaning of the word. And yes, that is why the International Court of Justice handling of genocide cases is worthwhile understanding alongside this, right?
You don't seem to do that. You just seem to make a claim and sort of assert that with no evidence whatsoever. You should work on that a little bit, I would say. Let's all improve the quality of this.
See, helpful. BadEmpanada is helpful and wants to improve the space. Who doesn't want to improve the space like BadEmpanada does? Who doesn't want to do that? What a lovely pause I've landed on.
Side of YouTube together by not just stating things that we back up with nothing. Anyway, so this next part is
True. Let's improve the space. Let's do it, BadEmpanada. Let's do it together. Like friends, best friends.
Quite funny, honestly. I'll let him finish here.
And it also leads to some really irrelevant statements like this one.
Answers of governments on matters like these have far more to do with whatever's most politically convenient for them than with them honestly assessing the historical evidence. So then,
I mean, we've already addressed that. There's nothing else to say. I don't disagree here. Countries accepting or not accepting whether or not something is a genocide is not really a helpful metric. It is a political gesture, but it's not really a significant metric on whether or not something is or is not factually a genocide. Oh, damn. That is... I've heard Haas is into street fighting. I've got it on good authority that Haas is actually into street fighting, so... Huh. I don't know. Maybe Haas? BadEmpanada does not feel like the athletic type, so... Haas, I guess. That is the person I would put my bet on.
not exactly reliable sources. For a particularly illustrative example of this, in 2003 and 2008, the Australian Parliament formally passed a resolution recognising the Holodomor as genocide. Yet it's also never actually
Yeah, we've sort of already went through this. Yes, we get it. Yeah.
formally acknowledged its own genocide of Aboriginal people, which there is an overwhelming scholarly consensus supporting. And Australia even rejected the results of a report which the government itself commissioned, which also came to the same conclusion.
Okay, so what? So Evil Empire number 1 supposedly did a bad thing, therefore bad thing by Evil Empire number 2 either didn't happen or doesn't count, or
But
is
that's not exactly the claim. The claim was that since Australia conveniently denies to accept its own genocide, why should it be trusted on asserting on whether or not a thing committed by other countries is a genocide? Which, which is that's an argument to make, but I don't really put much stake onto states saying whether or not something is a genocide. Considering that BadEmpanada did make fun of Khas for the two holes moment, I could actually see them fighting if they met in person. Damn. I mean, there were some people that Has wanted to fight in real life when debating them, so.
somehow less evil because you use the UN definition of genocide instead of the Oxford Dictionary definition or that other definition or some other definition. For instance, he cites the alleged Australian genocide of Indigenous people. Whether or not you agree if that was also wrong, what does it matter? It's completely irrelevant. Does it make Stalin starving out the Ukrainians any less evil? No, it does not. It is completely irrelevant. It is a meaningless tu quoque. The only thing...
I mean, genocide is not the only evil crime, so... something can be evil and not genocide. Just saying. If you don't classify something as... If you classify something as not genocide, it doesn't make it less evil. So...
thing that matters here is whether or not it can be proven that Stalin intentionally caused the death of millions.
Now, I honestly am flabbergasted at...
That's actually not... That's actually a pretty bad framing of the problem. Wow, I'm actually, instead of BadEmpanada, I'm actually pretty busy attacking the person here. Let's listen to this again. This is not a very good framing, and I will explain to you why, okay?
Intentionally caused the death of this tu quoque. The only thing that matters here is whether or not it can be proven that Stalin intentionally caused the death.
Like, there are Russian historians who have written books and academic articles concluding that the Holodomor was a genocide. Right? There are other crimes alongside genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc. Well, there's a crucial part to genocide, and that is intent. Okay? And now this person, this I person, has made a pretty big mistake in my opinion, and I will let you hear it again, and then I will sort of say why I think they made a mistake.
Death of millions. The only thing that matters here is whether or not it can be proven that Stalin intentionally caused the death of millions.
Whether or not it can be proven that Stalin caused intentionally the death of millions. Like, a mass killing can be caused intentionally, and a mass killing is not a genocide. Right? Like, mass killing is intentional. It's done on purpose. When we say intent in genocide, that you need intent, it doesn't mean that the act has to be intentional, that it has to be done on purpose. Okay? It means that you have to intend to destroy the group in whole or in part. Not that you need to kill people on purpose.
Now, I honestly...
That is a nitpick. I'm being nitpicky. The I person would probably say that I'm being nitpicky. But I'm okay with that because I'm a smarty pants. And yes, that is evil indeed.
Flabbergasted at this. I don't know. I feel like this is the sort of reaction that you would have.
I'm also flabbergasted. When you speak, you should not sort of stifle your mouth like that. You know?
If you simply don't understand what a counter-argument is,
You feel like you're a bit afraid and not confident in what you're saying when you sort of get into this position and speak. You know? It doesn't make you feel confident.
because you don't know how to
And we all know that you're a friendly, empathetic, helpful, diligent, and courteous person.
make one, which his counter-argument to me here kind of demonstrates. Okay, so let me explain this to you pretty simply. So,
Okay.
my video is a counter-argument to the Wikipedia article in the Holodomor genocide question as it was at the time when I made it. I understand it's been changed since, I don't really know how, but that's what my video is. So, when the Wikipedia...
Wait a minute. It's been changed, so you should check the changes and update your video or make a new video to update your views on the Wikipedia.
article on that subject begins by citing, as if they are some sort of authority, the governments of 14, 15, whatever it was, different countries who acknowledge the Holodomor as a genocide. Well, then it makes sense for me to respond to that with a counter-argument explaining why these countries acknowledging the Holodomor as a genocide doesn't actually matter at all for the question of whether or not it was a genocide. Because whether it is a genocide or not is something that is going to be determined through an analysis of the facts, not through pointing to the say-so of X or Y government. Let me explain to you what I actually did here. I explained why it is irrelevant to the question to cite the opinions of these governments on the issue, which is that governments are obviously political actors who make decisions based on political concerns rather than based on facts most of the time. And then to illustrate...
I mean, political concerns are also facts, but you're correct, technically speaking.
My point, because this is something that you should be doing, I singled out one of those governments, in this case the Australian one, because I'm an Australian, and I examined their position on the issue to illustrate what I mean with my point here, by pointing out the fact that, for example, they do not acknowledge the Australian genocide of Aboriginal people, because it's obviously not politically expedient for them to do so, because for one, that would open a whole can of worms for them legally. Whereas on the other hand, it is politically convenient for them to acknowledge the Holodomor as a genocide for a number of reasons. For example, their political alignment with the Western Bloc, which Russia is a geopolitical rival of, and Russia is pretty well known for not liking that position very much. And he goes on to sort of accuse me of making the argument here that the Holodomor is not a genocide because the Australian government said so and the Australian government is bad. No, that's not the argument that I was making. I'm making a counter-argument to this article. Criticism by turning it back on the accuser. You have answered criticism with criticism, especially given that this is like the first 10 minutes of my video and there's 50 minutes of my video where I explicitly engage with both sides of the argument in the academic sphere of
10 minutes, damn. Too much time sort of dedicated to the whole country thing, if you ask me. 10 minutes. It should have been less. It should have been 2 minutes.
Whether the Holodomor was a genocide or not. So this is completely nonsensical. He seems to think that what I'm saying...
You've plumped your video artificially.
Here is that Australia says it's a genocide and Australia is bad, therefore it's not a genocide, when that's not what I was saying at all.
At all?
I was just making a counter-argument to this article, which was using the Australian government as one of its supposed authoritative sources, which say that the Holodomor was a genocide, and explaining why that is wrong. So, actually, given that this sides of the argument in the academic sphere of whether the Holodomor was a genocide or not. So, this is completely nonsensical. He seems to think that what I'm saying here is that Australia says it's a genocide and Australia is bad, therefore it's not a genocide, when that's not what I was saying at all. I was just making a counter-argument to this article, which was using the Australian government as one of its supposed authoritative sources which say that the Holodomor was a genocide, and explaining why that is wrong. So we haven't really gotten off to a good start here. This guy does not seem to have very, very solid skills of basic deduction and reasoning. But let's continue.
Oh, come on, that's mean. You cannot just base that on the few minutes of a video. That's so mean. Don't be mean, BadEmpanada. You've already built such a nice reputation of being kind and courteous and helpful. Don't ruin it by being mean.
And see where he takes this.
And of course, the next problem is being nitpicky about definitions. For instance, take a look at this clip.
Okay, nitpicky about definitions.
Since the most common definition of genocide, using the UN definition, requires specific intent, he...
Well, it's sort of not exactly... It's not exactly correct to say it's the most common definition, since it's not that it's the most common, it's that it's basically the only one that has any backing in the legal system, the international law. There are 50 genocide definitions in academia, but it's not like they are less common. They just don't have as much backing when it comes to actual consequences.
He agrees with some other authors that bad policy that didn't turn out the way those implementing it had hoped cannot...
Whether or not Team Stalin was guilty of genocide in 1932-33 depends on how genocide is defined. If a strict legal definition is adopted based on the UN Genocide Convention, genocide against the Ukrainians in 1932-1933 is a charge for which there is some evidence, but it seems to the present author that it does not meet the standard of specific intent required to prove genocide. I think we can actually demonstrate intent, but we'll get to that hopefully. Hopefully we'll get an opportunity.
Not be considered genocidal by this common definition. He goes on to state that while by his...
Team Stalin's behavior in 1930-1934 clearly constitutes a crime against humanity, or a series of crimes against humanity, as that is defined in the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, Article 7. Which I believe, actually, I've heard somewhere that Russia does not actually accept that. Like the stream, thank you. Subsection 1D and H. And if the argument of the previous section of this article on national criminal law is accepted, then also subsection 1A of the statute would apply. Okay.
His assessment, Stalin's actions once the famine was underway, such as instituting a policy to turn back starving peasants fleeing the affected areas, do constitute crimes against humanity. There is nonetheless just not any...
I would say it also constitutes intent. Especially if you stack up all of the policies that were introduced at that time. I'm not sure if now is the right time to read those policies from the famous book Bloodlands.
Evidence fitting of the UN definition of genocide for the same reason that we just went over. Ellman, however, does believe that there is evidence that the Soviet leadership considered some of the famine's victims to have deserved their fate. Now, I just want to address this epic meme. There is evidence that the definition of genocide for this...
Okay, I will read it out now. I can always move it in editing, but it's not just that Stalin and the USSR sort of moved back the starving peasants. There's an amount of very specific policy that was targeted at Soviet Ukraine in particular that sort of indicated intent to destroy the group in part or in whole. And I will now read it from the acclaimed book Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. Hold on, I have to find it. Almost got it. I'm not going to read them all because it's quite a long time, but one moment. Let me find it. Soviet famines. One moment. There we go. Famine had struck parts of Soviet Russia as well as much of Soviet Ukraine in 1932. Nevertheless, the policy response to Ukraine was special and lethal. 7 crucial policies were applied only or mainly in Soviet Ukraine. In late 1932 or early 1933, each of them may seem like an anodyne administrative measure, and each of them was certainly presented as such at the time, and yet each of them had to kill. On 18th November 1932, peasants in Ukraine were required to return grain advances that they had previously earned by meeting grain requisition targets. This meant that the few localities where peasants had good yields were deprived of what little surplus they had earned. The party brigades and the state police were unleashed on these regions, and a feverish hunt for whatever food could be found. Because peasants were not given receipts for the grain that they did hand over, they were subject to endless searches and abuse. The Ukrainian party leadership tried to protect the seed grain, but without success. Seed grain being the grain used to, as the name implies, create new to seed new crops, to plant new crops. 2. 2 days later, on 20th November 1932, a meat penalty was introduced. Peasants who were unable to make grain quotas were now required to pay a special tax in meat. Peasants who still had livestock were now forced to surrender it to the state. Cattle and swine had been a last reserve against starvation. As a peasant girl remembered, whoever had a cow didn't starve. A cow gives milk, and as a last resort it can be slaughtered. Another peasant girl remembered that the family's one pig was seized and then the family's one cow. She held its horns as it was led away. This was perhaps the attachment that teenage girls on farms feel for their animals. But it was also desperation. Even after the meat penalty was paid, peasants still had to fulfill the original grain quota. If they could not do this under the threat of losing their animals, they certainly could not do so afterward. They starved. 3. 8 days later, on the 28th November 1932, Soviet authorities introduced the blacklist. According to this new regulation, collective farms that failed to meet grain targets were required immediately to surrender 15 times the amount of grain that was normally due in a whole month. In practice, this meant again the arrival of hordes of party activists and police with the mission and the legal right to take everything. No village could meet the multiplied quota, and so whole communities lost all of the food that they had. Communities on the blacklist also had no right to trade or to receive deliveries of any kind from the rest of the country. They were cut off from food or indeed any other sort of supply from anywhere else. The blacklisted communities in Soviet Ukraine, sometimes selected from as far away as Moscow, became zones of death. You know what? Let's be a bit generous. Let's be a bit generous and let's read one more. Let's read one more for good measure. On the 5th of December 1932, Stalin's hand-picked security chief for Ukraine presented the justification for terrorizing Ukrainian party officials to collect the grain. Vsevolod Baltitsky had spoken with Stalin personally in Moscow on 15 and 24th November. The famine in Ukraine was to be understood, according to Baltitsky, as the result of a plot of Ukrainian nationalists, in particular of exiles with connections to Poland. Thus, anyone who failed to do his part in requisition was a traitor to the state. Yet this policy line had still deeper implications. The connection of Ukrainian nationalism to Ukrainian famine authorized the punishment of those who had taken part in earlier Soviet policies to support the development of the Ukrainian nation. Stalin believed that the national question was, in essence, a peasant question. As he undid Lenin's compromise with the peasants, he also found himself undoing Lenin's compromise with the nations. Which actually I have a quote here for this from the page Marxists.org, where Stalin basically talks on this. Comrades, I think that Semich had not fully understood the main essence of Bolsheviks' presentation of the national question. The Bolsheviks never separated the national question from the general question of revolution, either before October or after October. The main essence of the Bolshevik approach to the national question is that the Bolsheviks always examined the national question in inseparable connection with the revolutionary perspective. And later, let's see. I think that Semich has not yet fully grasped all this, hence his attempts to reduce the national question to a constitutional issue, i.e., to regard it as a question of reform. That mistake leads him to another, namely his refusal to regard the national question as being in essence a peasant question, from his speech from the year 1925. So yeah. So let's continue. On the 14th of December, Moscow authorized the deportation of local Ukrainian communists to concentration camps on the logic that they had abused Soviet policies in order to spread Ukrainian nationalism, thus allowing nationalists to sabotage the grain collection. Baltitsky then claimed to have unmasked a Ukrainian military organization as well as Polish rebel groups. He would report in January 1933 the discovery of more than 1,000 illegal organizations, and in February the plans of Polish and Ukrainian nationalists to overthrow Soviet rule in Ukraine. The justifications were fabricated, but the policy had consequences. Poland had withdrawn its agents from Ukraine and had given up any hope of exploiting the disaster of collectivization. The Polish government, attempting to be loyal to the Soviet-Polish Non-Aggression Pact signed in July 1932, declined even to draw international attention to the worsening Soviet famine. Yet Baltitsky's policy, though it rode the coattails of phantoms, generated local obedience to Moscow's policy. The mass arrests and mass deportations he ordered sent a very clear message. Anyone who defended the peasants would be condemned as an enemy. In these crucial weeks of late December, as the death toll in Soviet Ukraine rose into hundreds of thousands, Ukrainian activists and administrators knew better than to resist the party line. If they did not carry out required requisitions, they would find themselves, in the best case, in the Gulag. And now, we don't have to read that. There are a few more. We don't have to read them. But a few questions arise. First, if we are not dealing with a genocide, then why was only Soviet Ukraine hit with the policies that I have just read? What made Soviet Ukraine so special as to target it specifically with those deadly policies? I guess I posit this question to BadEmpanada in the hopes that he will watch this video and react to it. Second question. If the peasant question is, in essence, the national question, and later in the Bloodlands it is stated that Stalin has considered nationalism, well, even in the quote that I read, the nationalists want to overthrow the Soviet order, the order of the first quote-unquote socialist country. So in essence, the nationalists are the enemies of socialism. And since the peasant question is the national question, it stands to reason to come to the conclusion that peasants are the enemies of socialism itself. And thus, to create a better world, one that will allow socialism to bloom and prosper, the group of peasants or nationalists needs to be destroyed in whole or in part, because otherwise they just are left as fundamental enemies of socialism, and that cannot be left to be unchecked. Is this sort of logic ridiculous? I will leave it to BadEmpanada to answer this question. And also keep in mind that Soviet Ukrainians just so happened to be primarily peasants. What a coincidence. So yes, I pose these two questions to my esteemed colleague, BadEmpanada, who is kind and courteous and diligent. So, and oh wait, third question. I'm sorry, third question. Can these deadly policies be simply called negligence? Can they simply be called mistaken policy that led to death? I'll also that is also a question that I sort of put forward to my esteemed colleague. Let's continue. Let's continue this wonderful video, because there's a lot left. We're on the 9th minute. And the video has 41 minutes and 55 seconds. So yes.
Same reason that we just went over. Ellman, however, does believe that there is evidence that the Soviet leadership considered some of the famine's victims to have deserved their fate. Now, I just want to address this epic meme that he puts on the screen here that also just so happens to blot out the source. Can you please explain what the fuck this is even about? Where did I say that it never happened, for one? Because clearly the famine happened and millions of people died. And where did I say they deserved it, for two? And how is this relevant to what's actually being said? Because what I'm doing here is merely summarizing what Michael Ellman, who actually does, by the way, think that the Holodomor was a genocide, said on the topic. So what in the holy fuck is this about? Do you just
I almost thought that you would say, what in the Holodomor? But
have a meme folder and you can't help yourself from using them as much as possible, even in cases where it makes no sense whatsoever? This is absolutely baffling. What I'm saying at this point of the video isn't even my own opinion. It's not even my own argument. I'm summarizing the argument of a scholar on the topic. You don't seem to understand that at all, and he actually, at least...
There's not much that I can add here. There's not much here for me to say, so I'll just let it run.
Partly agrees with your position, yet you seem to be accusing him of believing that it never happened and they deserved it? What the fuck are you saying? He's citing what some members of the Soviet leadership thought there, not his own opinion. How on earth could you listen to my summary of what he's saying there and then think that he's agreeing with them?
And this is really just an example of the source itself not being well reasoned out. He mentions that UN definition, so let's take a look at just what the UN considers to be a genocide.
Okay, let's look at the UN Genocide Convention.
Now,
anyone who pretends that it's consensus that it was not genocide is dishonest. There are plenty of scholars who consider it one. Yeah, there are. There are indeed.
main thing the UN has is a requirement for specific intent to be found that they actually intended to commit a genocide. Then a PDF detailing the Genocide Convention that the genocide definition is made up of two elements, the physical element or the acts committed, and the mental element, the intent. That to constitute genocide, there must be a proven intent on the part of the perpetrators to physically destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And
I would say that the peasant question, national question, nationalists want to topple the USSR government is a pretty good sort of clue. It's a pretty good sort of indicator of intent in my mind. Right?
well, the thing is, what Stalin did does indeed fit this definition. While it's true that there's no evidence of Stalin literally saying, yes, I want millions of Ukrainians to die by my actions, this...
Well, he did say something almost close when he said that peasants / nationalists are enemies to socialism itself. He also said that Ukrainians starving was a ploy by them to actually destroy socialism, that they were starving themselves to death on purpose, and that the fact that they are doing so just means that socialism itself is on the way to succeeding. So that staying the course is important. Which also actually, in my mind, plays into it being a genocide, because it's not something that Stalin is doing for pleasure or because, you know, he just hates Ukrainians. No, it's necessary. It's not something good or pleasurable. It's just necessary to destroy this group in order to go towards socialism. The group called Ukrainian nationalists has to be destroyed and then turned into the so-called Soviet people, the Soviet man, and then socialism can succeed. It fits to me.
sets an extremely unreasonable standard. Imagine if in a murder trial you have evidence that the defendant pulled the trigger and had a motive to murder the victim, but a lawyer tried to argue, well gee, we can't read my client's mind and prove that he knew pulling the trigger could end the victim's life, so it was actually manslaughter. That's basically the low-level reasoning we are dealing with here.
Okay, so this is the sort of
Okay, let's see what BadEmpanada says here. As talking about what is and isn't a genocide can be interesting.
thing that is determined not through you saying imagine and coming up with a hypothetical and being like, come on, I don't like this standard, because the UN definition in this word specific intent or special intent, as it is also often called, are legal concepts. They're legal concepts that have been actually tested and tried in courts. We have
I lost.
Definition and coming up with a
Dealing with here.
Okay, so this is the sort of thing that is determined not through you saying imagine and coming up with a hypothetical and being like, come on, I don't like this standard, because the UN definition in this word
I mean, that is the main, to be fair to BadEmpanada, that is the main difficulty of when it comes to the UN definition. And the UN definition, of course, has its flaws, but that is the main problem with determining what is and isn't genocide. Like, demonstrating that intent. Like, I sort of demonstrated a certain line of logic here. Like, peasant question is the national question, and the nationalist wants to topple the USSR government and apply with Poland. So anyone who cooperates with them is a traitor as well, and also the peasant group has to be dealt with as well. That fits the narrative of people perpetrating genocide having the logic of, in order to achieve a better world, in this case the better world would be a world of socialism, a group that stands in the way needs to be destroyed in part or in whole. In this case, the group is peasants. It makes sense. Although, of course, then you can further investigate it and ask for quotations, ask for documents that would sort of lead to that conclusion, etc., etc. Then you can further discuss it, sort of. If this line of reasoning can stand up to scrutiny, even. But at least we have a discussion now, right? It's not clear cut that there's no way to sort of demonstrate any sort of intent.
Specific intent or special intent, as it is also often called, are legal concepts. They're legal concepts that have been actually tested and tried in courts. We have precedents regarding them and stuff like that. If you had actually understood my video to any reasonable degree, you would have seen that Michael Ellman actually continued.
Don't be mean. Don't be mean. Being mean is not good. It's not good to be mean. You're destroying your reputation of a kind person in real time. This video. That's not good. You shouldn't do that. Stalin, the plebeian ruler of an agricultural country, the good statisticians knew or should have known the true size of the harvest and the effect of the migration ban and even the reduced grain procurements on the Ukrainian peasantry. Then, according to this more relaxed definition of intent, he was guilty of genocide. If one accepts. This citation comes literally 2 seconds after he cut off the clip he showed. I mean, we know that Stalin knew how big the famine was, because at some point he personally admitted to his close sort of associates that a famine was going on in Soviet Ukraine. So we know that Stalin not should have known. We know that he knew and that he just didn't care. Well, FJW, that's just your reasoning actually only works because political groups were removed from the Genocide Convention. And do you know who pushed for that the most? That's right, the Soviet Union. So, if political groups were not removed from the Genocide Convention, from the definition, then it would be such a clear-cut case that there would be no like Holodomor question, quote unquote. It would be a very clear-cut case. But I would make the case of my own that you can very much still call Holodomor a genocide, even if the political group was crossed out of the definition. Okay? That makes sense.
In a part that you cut off for some reason. Ellman cites a precedent that was set at the Rwanda Genocide Tribunal, which stated that authorities could be found culpable of the crime of genocide if they knew or should have known what the consequence of their actions would mean for a specific ethnic group. Now, the actual issue with Ellman's argument here and the affirmative for the Holodomor genocide question in general.
What is the problem of this? I love the quote above. I mean, for one, we already know that Stalin knew. We know from quotes of his own statements in private with his political, with his party, that he knew what the size of the starvation was.
Is there is no proof of specific intent regarding the targeting specifically of Ukrainians.
That's not, technically speaking, entirely true. Keep in mind, the Ukrainians were primarily an agricultural nation. Okay, Ukraine was primarily made of peasants. That was the biggest by far group within the Ukrainian nation. Okay, and so remember once again, to Stalin, the peasant question was the national question. He himself asserted that peasants were actually Ukrainian nationalists, and that Ukrainian nationalists have to be fought against because they want to topple the Soviet Union, which to me, to a reasonable degree, actually indicates that Soso, Comrade Stalin, had in fact targeted the Ukrainian nation. Does that make sense? An agrarian society, thank you. My English is failing me today. But you know what I mean. An agrarian society, correct.
That is to say, specific intent regarding the targeting specifically of Ukrainians. That is to say,
Ukrainians, so the Ukrainian nation.
Measures were taken against peasants for being peasants, whether they were Russian, Kazakh, Ukrainian, or any other nationality, rather than against Ukrainians for being Ukrainians.
Well, that goes against what Stalin himself said. That actually goes completely against what Stalin himself said. And once again, quoting his own words. Okay? Quoting his own words. Let me see. That mistake leads him to another, namely his refusal to regard the national question as being in essence a peasant question. To Stalin, that was connected. The peasant question was a question of nationalism, because as Stalin said, the bulk of a nationalist army are always the peasants. So no, even if they were targeted for being peasants, in essence, to Stalin, it was the same as them being targeted for being nationalists, which means that the group was in fact targeted for belonging to a specific nation.
This sort of question is absolutely crucial to whether something is a genocide or not. Of course, if you're not actually using the legal definition, then you can just sort of call whatever you want a genocide.
That is true, but I've just, like, you're arguing with Stalin himself on this separating nationalism from peasants.
And I mean, more power to you if you want to do
Yes.
that, but I can't really argue against that.
You cannot, but hopefully you will argue with what I'm saying here, no?
We need to agree on terms here. We need to agree on the sort of field that we're playing on. So if you want to say, well, lots of people died, so it's just a genocide for that reason, well, okay, that's fine. But that's unfalsifiable. So you can make an actual falsifiable argument, like according to the legal standard of genocide, it was a genocide because X, Y, and Z. Or
I mean, I did it just now. So I welcome you to argue with me about it. You're welcome to. I just gave you the key to the intent, the peasant question, which, to Stalin, was in essence a national question. Thank you.
you can just say, well, I think it should be a genocide because lots of Ukrainians died. The first argument can be reasonably responded to. The second obviously can't. And
Well, I hope to see a reasonable response then. I will be waiting. I'll be waiting with excitement. I'm excited. I'm excited to hear a reasonable response.
second is pretty much what your argument is here. And regardless, his example here, his sort of hypothetical, is a ridiculous caricature because no one who has any sort of familiarity with law really anywhere is going to think that intent can only be inferred from like statements like, oh, I want to kill all these people because I hate them for their ethnicity or whatever. No.
That's true.
Obviously, intent can also be inferred from actions. The problem with doing that in this case specifically is that there are
Yes.
plenty of scholars who have examined the evidence and concluded that actions were not taken against Ukrainians simply because they were Ukrainians. And
I mean, that's not an argument. Many scholars have come to a conclusion. You have to present us, like, you're doing the mistake that you accused your interlocutor of doing earlier. You're pointing to something without giving us anything. You just said many scholars disagree, but you need to substantiate it somehow. What did those scholars say? What do those scholars have to say about those policies that were targeting specifically Soviet Ukraine? What about the peasant question being the national question? What about the fact that Ukrainians were an agrarian society? How do those scholars sort of tackle with these truths? Like, you need to sort of make a case for that. You cannot just point to a number of scholars and say, well, they say there's just not enough evidence, because that's nothing. You have to present their findings if you want to have an argument, if you want to have something to be reasonably responded to.
And that is a crucial point because that's the defining factor of genocide. Acts carried out against a group specifically for that quality of being from that group. And this is why
Yeah, that's true.
for example, I'm going to provide an example. You seem to get a bit confused.
Okay, we're getting an example. I'm excited for the example. Okay. Is it going to be an example of is this going to be an example of intent that can be demonstrated, or is this going to be an example of a scholar that disagrees that the Holodomor is a genocide? We'll find out in a second.
When people do this, so I'm sorry if this confuses you a little bit here. The Cambodian genocide, as you know it, as I
Okay, the Cambodian genocide.
know it, was the killings of about 2 million people in Cambodia. Did you know that at trial, prosecutors didn't even try that as genocide? The prosecutors didn't believe that they could land convictions.
Yes, I actually remember that. Yes, I remember that. This is actually quoted in in that book that I've read. Genociders and their methods. The final solutions. Genociders and their methods. Yes. That was actually, they thought they couldn't land a conviction. Ironically enough, they thought they couldn't land a conviction for genocide because political and social groups were struck down from the genocide convention. Okay? I think that's the case where a religious minority was targeted, and thanks to that, the whole thing could be tried. But yeah.
Because most of them were just ethnic Khmer people killing other ethnic Khmer people, and their motive was clearly not to wipe out their own ethnic group. So yes, the question of intent to attack.
I'm pretty sure that was the thing that they had to sort of on religious. They had to do it on religious. I'd have to look into it again. But that was again because Lemkin wanted to include social and political groups into the Genocide Convention, and the USSR pushed against it. Like, keep this in mind when we also discuss this topic, that the UN Convention that we have now is, at the end of the day, a carved up version of the thing that we were supposed to initially get.
Attack this specific ethnic group or national group or whatever for that.
Whatever. You cannot name what sort of groups are part of the UN Convention.
That specific quality is absolutely core to the question of genocide. And that's a question that is at play here. It does not require a specific document of Stalin saying that he's doing it, obviously, but there are still many scholars, as I went over in my video on the
That is not an argument in on itself that many scholars said something. You need to present us with the findings of the scholars. That is true, but keep in mind that FJW, I'm gonna read this argument out loud because we're gonna add some arguments for our friend BadEmpanada to answer to. I really don't want to come across as defending Stalin here. That's okay. We're not here to. Stalin is not on trial. He is gone. I don't have much of a skin in the game. I leaned that it was more likely a genocide than not, but if you want to argue that the intent was there and there is no scientific consensus, that is a pretty strong sign that the intent was not there beyond reasonable doubt, and that is the standard that you have to meet in as the accuser. The problem of this argument is that here we actually do enter the political realm as well, because there is such a thing as the Armenian genocide question. And while it is much smaller than the Holodomor question, it is still a thing that exists. Why? Because Turkey has done all that it could to pressure the denial of the Armenian genocide. And while it did not work on the whole, it did cause some scholars to question it. So there is no 100% on the Armenian genocide, even though it's very well documented. So I'm not even sure if saying oh, some people disagree and hence you cannot prove it beyond reasonable doubt. I'm not sure that is entirely how that works. So that's not exactly how that works either. You can actually um, you can actually demonstrate intent without sort of beyond reasonable doubt, and certain scholars may still just interpret it differently and disagree with your conclusion. You don't need 100% consensus in order to be able to demonstrate something without doubt. He invokes many scholars for his historical arguments, but completely disregards the entire body of scholars that actually study genocides that have a diversity of definition of genocide. That is what you wrote? No, you said that because people doubt, it means that you cannot demonstrate it without beyond reasonable doubt. And my argument is that you can demonstrate it. You can demonstrate it beyond reasonable doubt, even if all scholars don't agree with it. Many scholars have read the books. Or we have cases like Tamils in Sri Lanka, where due political reasons, even war crimes accusations were not investigated, and there's strong evidence that there have been war crimes by the Sinhalese-led governments. Yeah, like, we have to take these things into account. We cannot just take into account politics when it's convenient to our sort of side of the argument. We also have to take politics into account when it's inconvenient for us. We cannot just say, oh, it doesn't matter if countries agree that the Holodomor was a genocide, which I actually agree with. It doesn't really matter all that much if countries agree or not agree that something was a genocide. But you cannot just then turn around and say, oh, because there are certain scholars that don't agree that the Holodomor was a genocide, that means that you cannot demonstrate intent beyond reasonable doubt. I don't think that's how it necessarily works.
Topic who have gone far beyond simple statements and looked at the actual actions and concluded that there was no special intent, thus that it was not genocide.
Well then, I'm eagerly awaiting for you to answer my 3 questions regarding the policies, regarding the peasant/national question, regarding those 2 will do fine. Just answer these questions and I'll be satisfied. I'll be satisfied beyond reasonable doubt if you do so.
Anyway, let's move on.
Looking at the
Let's move on.
evidence shows that Stalin had a motive due to wanting to squash anti-Soviet Union demonstrations in Ukraine and browbeat their national identity away because he was severely concerned with Ukrainian nationalism.
Now, I'd like to bring attention to this because this
Okay. We're sort of getting somewhere here. But the Ukrainian demonstrations were much sort of earlier and were different. But we're sort of getting into the Ukrainian nationalism thing. So I guess this is going to be addressed now to some degree. So we'll see. Kazakh and Russian peasants also died. You mistaken thinking that the peasant question only referred to the Ukrainian peasants. Okay, now I guess I will pose a question to the chat. Do you think a government and pay attention to this question because the answer is very important. Do you think that a genocidal regime can commit more than one genocide at once? Do you think that a government can target for destruction in whole or in part more than just a single group? Do you think that the Kazakhs might have also been targeted for destruction in whole or in part? Oh, Kazakhs are Russians now. And the Russians did not die nearly to the same extent as those groups. And I'm not sure if you were here before, but I guess I will extend my question to you. Why did the policies that I read from the book why were those implemented only in Soviet Ukraine, the policies that I read early in the stream? If you've not heard it, then you should rewind. You should rewind the video and listen to me reading them. Then maybe you will have your answer as to whether or not Ukrainians were targeted specifically or not. The Nazis didn't just target Jews. Sinti and Roma were just as much on their list. Also, did you know that the Nazi Germany also murdered Germans? Did you know that the Nazi Germany also murdered Germans? Which must mean that the Holocaust was not a genocide, that the Porajmos was not a genocide, because wow, Nazi Germany also targeted Germans. Which means you can now mockingly say that Nazi Germany genocided itself. I'm not sure you're making as strong arguments as you're thinking.
This is the first time in this entire section responding to my video that he actually cites a source. And it's an absolutely terrible source because this...
Oh, a source. Okay, let's read it. Though it had little impact at the time, the Ninth Circle now makes fascinating reading. It reflects the views of people who had been adults during the famine, who still remembered it vividly, and who had time to reflect on the causes and consequences. Warape, like Sonsovi a few years earlier, argued that the famine had been organized deliberately, that Stalin had planned it carefully, and that it was intended from the start to subdue and to Sovietize Ukraine. That is a strong argument to make. There is a case for that, certainly, considering the whole peasant question thing. Again. We see, there is one of the lines Holocaust deniers often use like argument is so brain dead I can't even. Peasants were targeted, not a group covered under the Genocide Convention. You yourself admit Russian peasants died, but try to brush it off only few. That's because, yes, Russian peasants died, but they were not targeted by specific deadly policy. And Ukrainian peasants were. Can you explain to me why? Resist why? Once you can answer to me that one question, we can, I guess, move forward with this. But logically, your argument doesn't hold up, and your only way of pinning dent on Stalin is to confuse peasants with Ukrainians erroneously. Oh, I confuse peasants with Ukrainians erroneously. Okay. Why were Ukrainian peasants specifically targeted with deadly policy and no other? I've actually read the policy on stream. You can rewind the stream and hear me read it. And also, because it seems like I have to bring the source on screen, I erroneously, you just said that I erroneously confuse peasants with Ukrainians. I guess the one in error is no other than Joseph Stalin then. concerning the national question in Yugoslavia, speech delivered in Yugoslav Commission by Joseph Stalin, March 30th, 1925. I think that Semik has not yet fully grasped all of this, hence his attempts to reduce the national question to a constitutional issue, i.e., to regard it as a question of reform. That mistake leads him to another, namely his refusal to regard the national question as being in essence a peasant question. It is also beyond doubt that after all, the peasant question is the basis, the quintessence of the national question. That explains the fact that the peasantry constitutes the main army of the national movement, that there is no powerful national movement without the peasant army, nor can there be. So I guess Stalin, the idiot that he was, erroneously confused peasants with Ukrainians. I mean, I don't mind you criticizing Stalin, but I'm just going by his own words. I'm just trying to be fair. I'm just trying to go with the source. The person that was basically responsible for the policy, the man himself. Because genocide and mass murder is tried differently. No, he's saying peasants are the class that support nationalism, not saying that they represent the nation. Your English maybe doesn't allow you to understand very well the source you were reading. No, actually, he doesn't say that they just support the nationalism. This source says, in essence, that peasants are nationalists. So they do, in fact, represent the nation, because they are the army of the nation. There can be no nation without them, in fact. That is what Stalin said, word for word. Without them, there can be no nation. It should be. Of course, it should be. They are the no. They don't represent the nationalist army. Now whose English is bad. They are the nationalist army. I'm sorry. You can twist and turn, but that is fact. If your interpretation were to be correct, then what's the point of calling the peasant question the essence of the national question? Can you answer me that? Because you don't seem... Maybe you've missed part of the quote, so I will read it once again. But it is also beyond doubt that after all, the peasant question is the basis, the quintessence of the national question. If the peasants simply supported nationalism, as you said, then how can they be the basis, the quintessence of the national question? Can you answer that for me? I'm awaiting the answer, because You seem to have better comprehension, so maybe you will interpret it for me. Interpret to me what Stalin meant when he said that the peasant question is the basis, the quintessence of the national question. Oh, okay. So without the peasant, there will be no national question, and instead international cooperation. That's good. Okay, we're getting somewhere here. So, if the peasants represent the national question, without them, there would be no national question. What should be done with the peasants then? And why? What are you targeting? What is your goal? What is your intent, even? Well, Silvana Crystal, take it up with Stalin. According to Stalin, the peasant question is the basis, the quintessence of the national question. And he is the one that did the Holodomor. So we have to go by his logic and not by someone else's, like yours. I'm afraid. By starving them. Turn them into pros. Is that what happened? Is that what happened in the Holodomor? I really don't want to have to read the policy again that was implemented to kill the Ukrainian peasants. They starved themselves by burning. Okay, I will read the policy again. I'll just cut it out in editing. I guess I don't have a choice. Because the literacy in my chat is unfortunately off the scale. They starved themselves. Okay. Help. Thankfully, we have a useful book here, which gives some interesting facts about the Soviet famines, my dear friend. Soviet famines. They starved themselves. I should have saved this. I should have saved the page. There you go. There we have it. Babies for CIA propagandas. Okay. It is not. It is actually not the Black Book. There we go. That is something specifically for you. Collectivization had involved the massive use of executions and deportations everywhere in the Soviet Union, and the peasants and nomads who made up the bulk of the Gulag's labor force hailed from all over the Soviet republics. Famine had struck parts of Soviet Russia as well as much of Soviet Ukraine in 1932. Nevertheless, the policy response to Ukraine was special and lethal. 7 crucial policies were applied only or mainly in Soviet Ukraine in late 1932 or early 1933. Each of them may seem like an anodyne administrative measure, and each of them was certainly presented as such at the time, and yet each of them had to kill. On the 18th November 1932, peasants in Ukraine were required to return grain advances that they had previously earned by meeting grain requisition targets. This meant that the few localities where peasants has had good yields were deprived of what little surplus they had earned. The party brigades and the state police were unleashed on these regions in a feverish hunt for whatever food could be found. Because peasants were not given receipts for the grain that they did hand over, they were subject to endless searches and abuse. The Ukrainian party leadership tried to protect the seed grain, but without success. 2 days later, on the 20th November 1932, a meat penalty was introduced. Ukrainian peasants who were unable to make grain quotas were now required to pay a special tax in meat. Peasants who still had livestock were now forced to surrender it to the state. Cattle and swine had been at least a last reserve against starvation. As a peasant girl remembered, whoever had a cow didn't starve. A cow gives milk, and as a last resort, it can be slaughtered. Another peasant girl remembered that the family's one pig was seized, and then the family's one cow. She held its horns as it was led away. This was perhaps the attachment the teenage girls on farms feel for their animals, but it was also desperation. Even after the meat penalty was paid, peasants still had to fulfill the original grain quota. If they could not do this under the threat of losing their farm animals, they certainly could not do so afterward. They starved. 8 days later, on the 28th of November 1932, Soviet authorities introduced the blacklist. According to this new regulation, collective farms that failed to meet grain targets were required immediately to surrender 15 times the amount of grain that was normally due in a whole month. In practice, this meant again the arrival of hordes of party activists and police with the mission and the legal right to take everything. No village could meet the multiplied quota, and so whole communities lost all of the food that they had. Communities on the blacklist and also had no right to trade or to receive deliveries of any kind from the rest of the country. They were cut off from food or indeed any other sort of supply from anywhere else. The blacklisted communities in Soviet Ukraine, sometimes selected from as far away as Moscow, became zones of death. The source itself says these policies were not only applied in Ukraine. Maybe I have to read it again. Nevertheless, the policy response to Ukraine was special and lethal. 7 crucial policies were applied only or mainly in Soviet Ukraine in late 1932 or early 1933. Maybe my pronunciation is horrible, but it clearly says here that these policies were special and were applied only or mainly in Soviet Ukraine. The 4th, on the 5th of September 1932, Stalin's handpicked security chief for Ukraine presented the justification for terrorizing Ukrainian party officials to collect the grain. Vsevolod Baltitsky had spoken with Stalin personally in Moscow on the 15th and 24th of November. The famine in Ukraine was to be understood, according to Baltitsky, as the result of a plot of Ukrainian nationalists, in particular of exiles with connections to Poland. Thus, anyone who failed to do his part in requisition was a traitor to the state. Yet this policy line had still deeper implications. The connection of Ukrainian nationalism to Ukrainian famine authorized the punishment of those who had taken part in earlier Soviet policies to support the development of the Ukrainian nation. Stalin believed that the national question was in essence a peasant question, and as he undid Lenin's compromise with the peasants, he also found himself undoing Lenin's compromise with the nations. Oh, I guess I have to read the sentence for the third time. Oh, selective. This is what this is why I say that you can prove something beyond reasonable doubt, and there will be people who will still sort of. Famine had struck. Nevertheless, the policy response to Ukraine. I will stress the word. I will stress the word. Nevertheless, the policy response to Ukraine was special and lethal. 7 crucial policies were applied only. Okay, I will repeat this part because it's important for you to hear it. Several crucial policies were applied only or mainly in Soviet Ukraine. Only or mainly. Or mainly. Oh, nice caveat. So you can just cross out the only part. What does only mean? What does the full, in fact, what does the full sentence mean? Or are we going to interpret the whole? Now, White's ears are blocked. He thinks Stalin would try to act on his beliefs to use force to prevent a force he categorized as reactionary. Ah, you don't know what mainly means. It means that those 7 policies were enacted in 2 ways. Either only to Ukrainian peasants or mainly. It means some of those policies were not only applied to Ukrainian peasants, but mainly to them. You're not really defeating my point. You're trolling me, aren't you? You're just trolling me at this point. It was both. It was only or. In some cases, in cases of some policy, it was only, and in case of some policy, it was mainly. You're trolling me. I'm not having that. Oh my god. What does the sentence, those policies were targeting only or mainly Ukrainian peasants? What does this sentence mean to you? And then I wonder why people scream at their chats. It means it wasn't only applied in Ukraine. No. It means that there were two cases with these policies. That either they were applied only to Ukrainian peasants, and in other cases, they were applied mainly to Ukrainian peasants, which means that there were absolute policies that were indeed only applied to the Ukrainian peasants. It seems like you're the one with the reading comprehension problem. Because if your version was correct, then there would be no reason to write only or mainly. We would only have the sentence, those policies were enacted mainly in Soviet Ukraine. Do you think that the two sentences, those policies were mainly or only enacted in Soviet Ukraine, and those policies were mainly enacted in Soviet Ukraine, do you think that those two sentences are synonymous, are identical? Do you think that those sentences that I said are identical? Yeah, it was only applied in Ukraine. They would have written only applied in Ukraine. You're correct. But there are 7 policies. 7. Some of them were only enacted in Soviet Ukraine, and some of them were mainly enacted in Soviet Ukraine. It's a perfectly logical sentence. Both things happened because we had 7 policies. I'm not sure what you're not understanding. I don't see what your problem is. I think it's just that thank you finds your dislike of Sun insulting and is unwilling to admit that. I really hope that the reasonable response from BadEmpanada will not be that. I'm sorry. I apologize. Apologize. Oh yeah, you're not the person. You're not the person I'm talking to, FJW. You actually made much better arguments than you actually made arguments, unlike Resist White. But yes. Yes. They actually made arguments, and this person seems to struggle with that. Okay, let's look at the source. I'm not sure if to even keep this in the segment proper. Jesus.
This is not actually a statement of fact, and it doesn't actually say what he's saying it does. This is rather just a citation of one academic's opinion on the matter. So, he said here that Stalin had a motive due to wanting to suppress anti-Soviet demonstrations and the Ukrainian national identity. Yet he
I want to see the national identity sort of argued. Yeah.
Source here is
Fortunate.
one scholar from 1983 simply stating that Stalin had planned it carefully and that it was intended from the start to subdue and Sovietize Ukraine. All of this is simple statements that are backed up by no evidence. It's this author, Warope, says this, therefore it's true. If you actually have specific evidence that Stalin intentionally caused a famine to attack anti-Soviet demonstrations and Ukrainian national identity, I would hope that you could provide it because it's
He didn't cause it. I mean, he did sort of cause it with his policy of collectivization. So in that sense, he actually did also cause it, but he also implemented policy targeting specifically Ukrainians. So those two things were, you know, they're tied, sort of.
It's something that has eluded scholars up until this point. But you haven't actually done that. What you've done is just cite what one scholar said 40 years ago. Talk about misusing sources. I can really tell that you're out of your comfort zone here and you're not really familiar with doing this at all. If you want to argue that Stalin intentionally inflicted the famine
We have talked about this. MS with Fu.
on Ukrainians against them for being Ukrainians, you're going to have to deal with all of the counter-arguments in the matter, which ideally you would do not by responding to my video on it, which is itself a counter-argument to a Wikipedia article, but by responding to the scholars who were cited in that Wikipedia article and whose work on the matter I thus cited in my...
Okay, I've sort of touched upon this. It's like irrelevant.
video who think the Holodomor was not a genocide. You need to look at their work, go over it, explain just how and why you think it's wrong. Because if you don't do that, it simply means that you're intentionally avoiding the best counter-arguments to your argument on the matter. In this case, we're talking about counter-arguments.
What is the counter-argument to the nationalism thing? I mean, they... Okay, let's listen to it. Let's listen if it's going to address what I said on the matter of the nationalism. Why are we watching this creep? Because he is wonderful and I want to talk about the Holodomor.
That came much later than the source that you cited here, with evidence that was not available to this author when he wrote this. By the way, he died in 1989. So to go back and just cite
Wait, Lucy mentioned?
this guy as some sort of authority who's supposed
When was I mentioned? Hold on. Did I miss it?
to be in 89. Evidence that was talking about avoiding the best counter-arguments to your argument on the matter. In this case, we're talking about counter-arguments that came much later than the source that you cited here, with evidence that was not available to this author when he wrote this.
Oh, I thought you said I was mentioned in the Oh, I'm so silly. I'm gonna have to cut this out. This is embarrassing.
By the way, he died in 1989. So to go back and just cite this guy as some sort of authority who supposedly proved that Stalin inflicted the famine intentionally, specifically to kill Ukrainians, while ignoring the work of, 5 or 6 different scholars who I went over. In my video on this topic, is just lying by omission. Yeah, there's not really much else to say about this bit.
Oh, we're not going to address the whole nationalism thing then. Okay.
Very, very amateur. This is specifically why I think that YouTubers should probably avoid trying to seriously treat history, because most of you are very much ill-equipped to do so. Because you're beginning with this preconceived conclusion that you're trying to back up, and it seems that the only way that you can back it up is by going back literally 40 years and citing nothing more than the say-so of a guy who wasn't even a historian who died.
You're not a historian, BadEmpanada, unless I'm missing something. Maybe I have gaps on your education. That's my bad. I'm sorry. But as far as I know, you're not a historian yourself, are you?
Died in 1989. You know, I could respond to that with the say-so of actual historians from recent times who have worked with new evidence from the Soviet archives to pretty thoroughly debunk, at least until further notice, until better evidence becomes available, the idea that the famine was intentionally inflicted on Ukrainians for being Ukrainians. Because that thesis was primarily based on speculation and on this idea.
Oh, wait, hold on.
That being Ukrainian until better evidence from the actual historian.
Now we're getting into the argument, finally. Perfect. Hit me with it.
Could respond to that with the say-so of actual historians from recent times who have worked with new evidence from the Soviet archives to pretty thoroughly debunk, at least until further notice, until better evidence becomes available, the idea that the famine was intentionally inflicted on Ukrainians for being Ukrainians. Because that thesis was primarily based on...
Well, it's not that it was inflicted, it was weaponized, right? The famine itself was indeed the produce of a failed policy of collectivization. That we cannot deny. But certain policy which targeted Ukraine were indeed targeted to starve them to death. In fact, if it were not for those policies, in fact, if Stalin would have opened certain reserves, Ukrainians would not have died in such numbers. That was deliberate. That part was deliberate policy. Because the Ukrainian crops were not so low as to cause mass starvation. They were actually not. Not we're gonna omit that part, are we?
On speculation and on...
Yeah.
This idea that the evidence would eventually prove it. Basically, the lack of evidence... And
keep in mind, there was enough grain to feed people. It was just that it was taken away to export to quicken the process of, making the country less agrarian and more industrialized. It was all taken away for export. There was enough food to feed the starving peasants. And even a few months, as much as few months, pausing in the policy would have saved basically millions. But it was deliberately not done.
Enabled it. But now that there is much more counter evidence to that notion, it kind of complicates things for them. Thus why people like this have to go back to sources from 40 years ago, just confidently stating something without actually providing any evidence for it.
And ripping...
So, we're actually, I guess I don't really have anything to say here, since that's not what I'm arguing against or for. In 1933, the cities knew that the villages were dying. The leaders and administrators of the Communist Party and the government knew that the villages were dying. Also, by the way, in Soviet Ukraine, the cities were starving as well, just so you know. People were in long lines to get just a bit of food, and many people died, and there were bodies on the streets and on the pavement, just so you know. The cities were dying as well. He probably understood to use the event to weaken the groups he understood as political enemies. Of course, that was deliberate.
Food at gunpoint from people who are already starving to death is clearly an action that any person who does not suffer from severe mental disability can understand to be a death sentence. In other words, to claim that it wasn't a genocide by the UN definition, they are effectively saying, you can't prove that Stalin knew that locking down and stealing food from starving Ukrainians...
Oh man, I'm not a big fan of presenting the arguments like this, because it just opens up... I'm not a big fan. I do not endorse making argumentation in this form.
...would kill them.
Especially since it's not actually a sound argument, because a death sentence is not necessarily genocide. You can kill someone and it cannot necessarily genocide is genocide is not just murder on a bigger scale. Okay, we have to remember that. So there is not a very strong argument. Genocide is not just when you murder a lot of people.
Therefore, it wasn't a genocide.
Now, this part of the video is citing a book by Anne Applebaum, who is a journalist for one, not a historian, and it is again making a pretty empty statement.
Oh, you do have the book by Anne Applebaum, The Red Terror, I think it's called. Anne Applebaum. But what she's saying here is correct, actually.
In 1933, the cities knew the villagers were dying, the leaders and administrators of the Communist Party and the government knew the villagers were dying, the evidence was in front of everyone's eye. Yes, they did know that. And what's the point that you're trying to make here? How does that knowledge prove they were specifically trying to kill Ukrainians? Because villagers in Kazakhstan were also dying. Villagers in Russia were also dying. And
not to the same extent. The villages in Russia were not dying near to the same extent. And I would also make a claim that what happened to the Kazakhs could also be very much defined as a genocide under the UN definition. The Kazakhs are the worst example that you can give because the Kazakhs were nomads. And so Stalin figured that in order to industrialize, he will first force them to become farmers and then sort of force them out of being farmers. So Stalin took away sort of the nomad lifestyle of the Kazakhs, forced them to become farmers without properly teaching them how to be farmers, sort of forced them to settle down. And when they ran out of, when the crops were not as good as expected, since they didn't know how to farm, they had to eat their own animals because they were nomads, they had animals. And when they ran out of their animals, they died of starvation. Because of course, you cannot just force a nomad people into a lifestyle of being in one place, tell them you are now farmers, and not properly teach them how to farm, and expect the results to be good. I'm sorry, I would argue heavily that the Kazakhs were also targeted for destruction, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. Again, Nazi Germany targeted Jewish people as well as the Roma. The Holocaust happened alongside the Poraimos. You know? Like, a regime can target more than just one group for destruction. And I'm telling you that the Soviet Union targeted many groups for destruction.
don't worry, we're going to be dealing with Anne Applebaum later at the end of this segment, but
Oh no, Anna Applebaum is put on the spot.
not exactly a very good source to say the least, and there is a reason why people like this tend to stick with the pop history that does not actually engage with the academic counter-arguments, because these
How do you know she doesn't? Wait, how do you know she doesn't?
sorts of pop history books written by mostly by non-historians and not properly engaging with
You're not a historian, and you're engaging with the topic. So you should just be dismissed out of hand. What makes you different from Anne Applebaum? You're not a historian. I don't understand. You're speaking on this subject with such confidence and such air of, competency, and yet you say others cannot because they're not historians, somehow? By writing her pop historical book, she's doing the same thing as you. She's commenting on the issue upon having learned about it.
the actual counter arguments on the matter, do things in the only possible way in which the intentional genocide thesis can be sustained. Well, intentional genocide is kind of a dumb way to...
Also, just so you know, Timothy Snyder is absolutely a historian. So the book that I'm using here today for this video is absolutely a valid source. Before I get flack from our friend BadEmpanada for using this particular thing as a source.
put things, because genocide is always intentional, but you know what I mean. Where she just straight up ignores all of the more recent scholarship on the matter that has completely upended this idea that it was an intentional genocide. And
well, can you provide some of that? I assume you looked into it and you can present us with anything. I assume that is why the video is 40 minutes long, because you're gonna bring up some new discovered things that sort of put intent into question. Anne Applebaum had some strange relations, but she has an undergrad level in history. So she has what you're saying in essence is that she has a higher level of competency officially than him. She has a higher degree in history than him, unless BadEmpanada will say that he had some history degree. So it is not true that she has no training as a historian. Oh, interesting. How interesting. How fascinating. That is one big thing to overlook, BadEmpanada. I thought you were known for your huge preparation for everything that you do. I guess I was wrong. I am proven sorely incorrect.
she chooses instead to basically cite things out of context, to cite things that have since been debunked. Basically, she rehashes...
Can you provide examples? Can you provide examples of the things that she quotes and that were debunked? Can you provide examples of the things that she quotes out of context? I haven't read her book yet, so it would be interesting to... Hello. It would be interesting for you to provide examples of such things happening. No? You accuse that other YouTuber that debunks you, quote unquote, that they do not present anything, but so far you're not presenting anything either. You just assess that Applebaum lies, misrepresents, misquotes, and provides quotes that were debunked with newer discovery. So you should have no problem producing those quotes and how they were debunked with newer studies, no? You cannot just say it. Why should I believe you? No offense, we all really love you, but why should we believe you? You're not cringe. You're not cringe, Mr. Lin. I unless you're BadEmpanada, that is. I hope you're not. Yeah, BadEmpanada goes after Timothy Snyder's work as well. Damn, that is unfortunate. I'm gonna have to bring in some Polish. Oh wait, Polish sources also do not count, because Polish people are just ungrateful Soviet serfs.
Robert Conquest's work from the 1980s without dealing with any of the developments since then that would be inconvenient to...
I haven't quoted Robert Conquest once, and this book is from... This book is from what year exactly? I'm pretty sure it was made after the Soviet archives were open. 2010. I think 2010 was well after the Soviet archives were open. When were the Soviet acts? Hold on. '90. Phew. Phew. Good. Saved. All right.
to her thesis. She does
Got
not
him.
deal with the work of Stephen Wheatcroft and Michael Davies. Oh, actually, she cites it, but she cites it when convenient to her, but she ignores the fact that their overall work was arguing against her thesis. That's very bad form in a book that is supposedly
I'm sorry, what?
like against her thesis. That's very bad form in a book overall work, but she cites it when convenient to her, but she ignores the fact that their overall she cites it, but her thesis. She does not deal with the work of Stephen Wheatcroft and Michael Davies. Oh, actually, she cites it, but she cites it when convenient to her, but she ignores the fact that their overall work was arguing against her thesis. That's very bad form in a book that is supposedly like
1991. Close enough.
some sort of serious treatment of the topic and stuff like that. And I'm going to provide an article by Mark B. Torger, an actual historian, actual subject matter expert, later in the video, which
Okay, let's go. Let's see the article.
shows this far beyond any reason.
Yeah, but the problem is that BadEmpanada produces work on the Holodomor, and he himself does not meet the standard of being a historian. A video work is also a work on the Holodomor. He's putting his thing out there on the topic of the Holodomor and presents it as a credible source of criticism.
Reasonable doubt that her book is absolutely awful and should not be taken seriously by anyone who is examining this question with any level
Who are you to judge it? You're not a historian yourself.
of honesty. He says here that they were ripping food at gunpoint from people who were clearly starving, but this citation on the screen doesn't actually say that. That's two citations that he's made in a row here that simply do not actually say what he says they do. They do not even remotely come close to backing up the claim that he's making. I just want to note that this guy literally cannot express himself without putting like 1,000 cringeworthy memes on the screen.
I agree, he might mean this, but he should be precise if he tries to undermine authority.
And like, dude, you should.
I mean, he should not, if he wants to undermine authority, he should not try to project authority without meeting the same standard, no? Anna Applebaum, as far as I'm concerned, has bigger qualifications to speak on this than him, and yet he does, with such big, I don't know,
need to change the person
confidence.
like ASAP. This is not healthy. Like, what else is there to say about this?
This legitimately is the reasoning that is being used. I wish I was joking.
Wait, how is that the reasoning that's being used? Who used that reasoning exactly? Because Michael Ellman, who I was summarizing in the part before this that he was supposedly responding to here, didn't use that reasoning, nor was I even citing him in agreement with him, because he actually agrees with you. He thinks the Holodomor was a genocide. Are you a bit lost? Did you get a bit confused? I would think that the fact that I was showing a source on the screen while clearly summarizing what someone else was saying would sort of clue you in to who was making the argument there. And I would think that you would maybe have the attention span to wait like 5 seconds when I get to the next part, where Ellman, as
Okay. Oh, why the meanness?
showed, clearly argued his reasoning for why he thinks that it should be considered genocide, even if technically by a base reading of the UN definition, it might not be. So, dude, what the fuck are you even saying? You should be embarrassed, I'm sorry.
So yeah, time to state the obvious. It doesn't matter how much work a scholar has put into studying Soviet history. If the reasoning behind their claim is demonstrably insane, they should not be taken seriously.
How is the reasoning behind Ellman's claim insane? I don't even agree with him. He agrees with you, by the way. It's certainly not insane. He just says, well, you know...
I really don't have anything to add here to this part. Like, there's nothing to add here.
The scholars have argued that there is no specific evidence that Ukrainians...
Know that so far, BadEmpanada has not really presented any sources, any specifics, any actual claims. It's just been mocking this poor guy for 22 minutes, 50 seconds.
were targeted for being Ukrainians. But personally, I think that there was sort of this level of neglect that perhaps under this legal precedent that was set in the Rwanda tribunals, it could be considered genocide. That is his argument. That's his reasoning. Where did you get this? What the fuck are you talking about? What is going on? And what is this creepy ass AI clown? Why do the clowns have clowns on their chest, dude? You should be ashamed. I don't know what this video is, but you should be ashamed of it. This is hilarious. Thank
I
you.
wonder if it's gonna be. I wonder if BadEmpanada is gonna be ashamed of my video. We already have some level of familiarity, you know. You've already exchanged videos.
You so much for making this.
Well, it may be true that we indeed cannot magically go back in time and magically read Stalin's mind, and therefore we cannot know by whatever magical means, by this unrealistic empiricist standard of evidence, for absolute 100% certainty, what the freaking hell Stalin was thinking. This same standard could be applied to any crime to claim it wasn't intentional, and it would also be impossible to prove.
No, that's really not the case at all. The reason why it is argued by many scholars that the Holodomor was not a genocide
Oh, I want to hear the reason why many scholars argue that the Holodomor was not a genocide. I would actually like to see the reasoning behind it.
is not solely because there are no specific statements of intent from Stalin or from other Soviet officials saying
So why then?
we're doing this famine to kill the Ukrainians. It's because
Oh no. The famine was not done to kill the Ukrainians. That I agree with. But certainly it was weaponized when it happened due to the failed collectivization, right?
it was a wider Soviet famine, and the same measures that exacerbated it that were taken against Ukrainians were also taken against everyone else who was affected by it. And you clearly
Oh no, there were not. Clearly, we have read some of the 7 policies that were only or mainly targeted against Ukrainians. So you're sort of mistaken. There were measures taken primarily against Ukrainians. This is not a thing that you can argue.
can't refute that because you're just sort of saying smugly that you're right without
I just refuted it.
really backing it up or dealing with the counter arguments in any real way because you're just strawmanning them completely. You actually haven't directly cited a single counter argument. You haven't cited any of the
Pot meat cattle. You just asserted that Applebaum misquotes things, but you never gave an example of the things that she misquoted, and also never gave an example of a quote that later was debunked due to new discovery. You're doing the same thing as that person is doing. It's just okay when you do it and not okay when that person does it. But
any of the scholars that I cited, which was 5 or 6 of them, who have argued that it wasn't a genocide. You haven't directly responded to any of that. Your only response here is just a complete misunderstanding of what Michael Ellman, who is a scholar who believes it was a genocide, was saying. I'm absolutely gobsmacked. I'm sorry. This is far below my level, and I shouldn't be responding.
This is so... I like this. This is so far beyond my level. This is so far beyond my level. I totally should not be responding. And yet here we are. Here we are with you responding to it. Yeah, policies can be targeted. How many people? 30,000. Damn.
To it, but sorry, it's easy content. Sorry, guys.
Oh.
And you're probably amused by this anyway.
At some point, you have to recognize man as a rational actor and apply some basic common sense and some basic Occam's razor to what they most likely were intending.
Common sense. I don't like the argument of common sense.
Qualitative analysis.
There are many arguments in the video that make this sort of analysis and come to the complete opposite conclusion that you think they should. You have ignored them completely to instead just talk smugly and put memes on the screen. Dude, your attention span is totally fucked. Turn off the social media. Get off 4chan. Read a book, an actual physical book.
I am reading a book, but you don't like it. The problem is you don't like my books. You don't like the books that I read. I'm sorry. Even though it is a physical book. You don't like my physical books.
Think about the arguments within it. Engage with them. Because this is no replacement. What you're doing here is no replacement for that. Here's just some of the examples of the citations in my video that specifically talk about this. Stephen Kotkin.
Okay. All of these actions were woefully insufficient for avoiding the mass starvation in the countryside caused by his policies in the face to challenging natural conditions. Still, these actions do not indicate that he was trying to exterminate peasants or ethnic Ukrainians. I mean, the 7 policies, 4 of which we have read on stream, would sort of argue otherwise. In the Kazakh Autonomous Republic, probably between 35 and 40% of the titular nation is compared with 8 to 9% of Slavs there perished from starvation or disease, not because the regime targeted Kazakhs by ethnicity, but because regime policy there consisted of forced denomadization. Similarly, there was no Ukrainian famine. The famine was Soviet. Okay, let's take this step by step. First of all, it was a targeted policy against the Kazakhs, and they were given no tools to become farmers properly. Yeah, it's a good book. Second of all, yes, there was no Ukrainian famine. There was a Soviet famine, but there was the Ukrainian Great Hunger caused by Stalin during the Soviet famine. It's not complicated. We read the examples of targeted policy. If it was not for that policy and the taking away of the grain from Ukrainians, they would not have starved. The Soviet Union had enough grain for people not to die. It was all exported because industrialization. So yes, of course, it became very convenient for Stalin to get rid of the group, nationalists, that was standing in the way of socialism.
B. Torga, who argued that the cause of the famine was mostly natural. Therefore,
Excuse me? The cause of the famine was mostly natural. The famine was mostly caused by collectivization. Was collectivization a natural occurrence? Was the collectivization like as a force of nature that swept through the Soviet Union? No, that has to be a joke. What a coincidence that most of those huge famines that targeted that sort of Ukraine suffered from miraculously almost always correlated with policy that the Soviet Union did, first during the war sort of policy of Lenin, and then during the collectivization of Stalin. What do you know? What a coincidence.
it could not have been an intentional genocide. Stephen Wheatcroft,
Hold on, that's very dishonest language.
who was mostly natural. Therefore, it could not have been an intentional genocide.
The famine. It is irrelevant, but I'd like to introduce some facts into things. It is irrelevant, yes.
Stephen Wheatcroft, who argued that new documents from the
Yes, that's right. Even a natural caused event can be weaponized to exterminate a group.
Soviet archives show that the Soviet government carried out a large number of secret relief methods, yes, for Ukrainians, that rendered the previous conclusions that it was a genocide which originated in the 1980s obsolete.
That is interesting because my book, full of sources, full of primary sources, which are those opened archives, say otherwise, that all aid was forbidden. And this book presents us with policy that also forbids aid. So I have sources here. Are you gonna present examples? Or are you just gonna present a quotation from a guy that says actually news sources say that there was secret relief? Can I see the documents regarding that secret relief? Can I see it? Yes, please. Can I see it?
Robert Davies and Stephen Wheatcroft also argue that the collectivization of farming, which was carried out by Soviet officials, was undertaken earnestly. They believe that what they were doing would work, and then it...
That is irrelevant. It caused the famine. It is irrelevant if it was implemented earnestly. That's one. And its failure was weaponized to target Ukrainians. That is fact number 2. Those things are not exactly mutually exclusive.
It didn't. Stupid, yes. Neglectful, absolutely. Intentional genocide. No, it's not the same thing. These are the sorts of arguments that you need to seriously deal with, and not just on the level of you, like, offhandedly...
I know. I do have to deal with the argument of you saying that the collectivization itself and the famine, which in Ukraine meant just lower crops than expected. Like, Ukraine did not produce starving level of crops. We need to remember that. Ukraine still produced the levels of crops that would be sustainable for the population. It was bad for the goals of the Soviet Union for export. That is a really crucial and important thing to remember, that even though, yes, a famine happened, sort of like a lowering of the number of yield happened because of collectivization, the yield itself was not so low as that it could not feed the population of Ukraine. It absolutely could. It's just that it was all taken away. Yeah, of course. Again, it's irrelevant. Yeah.
smugly discounting them by saying, oh, the reasoning here is so bad, when you didn't even understand what they were saying. No, you need to specifically deal with the evidence that they are citing. You need to tell us why they're misinterpreting it. Why it's...
I mean, you're not presenting okay.
wrong. You need to provide counter evidence. You can't just...
Oh! Like you did... Oh, never mind. You didn't. It literally... Work with your own standards.
Put some memes on the screen and talk smugly, and that's all. God, man. Anyway, let's continue.
I mean, you just talk smugly. You don't even put the effort to put memes on the screen. At least this person has memes. You have nothing.
BadEmpanada seems to double down on this silly reasoning when he attempted to refute the book Bloodlands, completely hand-waving it away as debunked without really going over it at all.
Isn't it interesting?
Oh, Bloodlands! The book! Oh my god, the book that I quoted today. Let's go. I'm gonna get criticized. I'm gonna get criticized right now by a BadEmpanada. My bad. Oh, this is gonna be good. This is going to be good.
How this guy accuses me of hand-waving away this book, when his response to my video is less than 10 minutes long, or about 10 minutes long, something like that, and it's pretty much just him hand-waving away the entire video, completely ignoring all of...
Oh, so we're not gonna hear the criticism of Bloodlands.
The scholarship that I cited that contradicts what he wants to believe, and instead just cherry-picking and completely misunderstanding what Michael Ellman was saying. Funnily enough, he's also hand-waving away my argument for why Timothy Snyder's book Bloodlands is bad. He doesn't actually...
Why is it bad? I mean, he is a historian. He meets that criteria. No? Damn.
Actually respond to it directly, nor even mention it. Pretty shitty form there. Perhaps it's because he's aware that he
So why is the Bloodlands book bad? My book. Can you see my book? It's here. Wait, what is happening?
he's not capable of actually responding to it, because what I said was just unequivocally true. My argument for why this book sucks was that, one, it's essentially a rehash of arguments from the 1980s that have since been developed on, that have since been rendered obsolete by scholarship that is much more recent. And that happens to therefore contradict what this guy wants to believe. Probably why he didn't actually respond directly to my rebuttal to Bloodlands. And number two, and this is probably the worst part,
Yeah.
Timothy Snyder in his book directly cites sources like Wheatcroft and Davies when convenient to him, while ignoring their overall arguments that rebut him. So it's a book that makes an argument that
So can you give us examples? I want to see examples.
the Holodomor was an intentional genocide, while citing people who argued otherwise, the facts and figures that they cited and stuff like that, yet not actually even addressing their argument, not actually even mentioning that their counter-argument to him exists in his book. He just ignores it. And that's absolutely horrible form.
Yeah, that's because books are not debate circles. You present an argument. You don't debate other authors in your book. What do you mean? Are you saying that he should have I don't know, given a full chapter to debating some other authors on the Holodomor?
Just like how it's absolutely horrible form for this guy right here to ignore the counter-arguments of the 6 or 7 different scholars who I cited in my video on the topic who think it wasn't a genocide, in a video that purports to be responding to my video. So just like Timothy Snyder, this guy clearly knows that those sources exist, and he made a strategic decision not to respond to them. I wonder...
Historical books are not tasked to responding to other historians' arguments. History books are not debates. Everyone uses Wheatcroft and Davis numbers. They just don't like the weird conclusions that's beyond the data.
Why? I don't wonder...
So that's why Bloodlands are bad? Okay, that's... I'm waiting... I quoted Bloodlands in this video, so I'm just waiting for you to debunk the arguments presented. We'll see if you're gonna respond. We're gonna tag BadEmpanada in this.
Why? I know why he didn't, because he can't. I know why Snyder didn't respond to Wheatcroft and Davies, even though he cited them and demonstrated that he knows about their work. Because he couldn't. It's really that simple.
Well, why couldn't he? Can you demonstrate why he couldn't? Like, you have to... You cannot just say that he couldn't. You have to demonstrate it. You're not... Once again, you're doing the thing that you accuse the other person of. You're not presenting any counter arguments.
Decided to read what Bloodlands had to say myself. One of the things it pointed out was the blacklist. This was a policy the Soviet...
Oh, I read this. Oh, this is going to be countered by BadEmpanada. One of the things that I read on this stream. Okay, wonderful. Wonderful. This is going to be countered now by BadEmpanada. All right.
Soviets put in place where communities in Ukraine that failed to meet their production quotas would then face multiplied quotas, specifically multiplied by 15 times, which of course they had no chance of meeting. And if they failed to meet this impossible standard, then the state took everything from them and barred them from receiving food deliveries.
Okay, I bet this is gonna be called fake news or something. I shouldn't speculate. Let's just listen to...
Basically condemning them to death. Unless, again, you want to argue that Stalin didn't know that taking food from and multiplying quotas on starving Ukrainians would kill them.
I actually really like this part, because this is sort of a teaching moment.
Okay, let's listen to the teaching moment from the non-historian, by the way.
For how you can sort of manipulate things to say what they're not actually saying.
Okay.
He cites as sort of proof from Timothy Snyder's book that there was a genocide specifically directed and intentionally directed to kill Ukrainians.
I mean, this in itself is not proof of genocide, but what it is an example of targeted policy. You cannot deny that. This is an example of targeted policy, which alone does not prove genocide, you're right, but it does add up to the argument. It does sort of add to the argument.
By the fact that collective farms that failed to meet grain targets were required immediately to surrender 15 times the amount of grain that was normally due in a whole month. But do you see an issue with this? It's all collective farms. It's not just Ukrainian collective.
Oh, how interesting. Just before, BadEmpanada said about avoiding inconvenient quotes. Oh my god. I happen to have the book here with me. Again, for the 10th time, I think. Famine had struck parts of the Soviet Russia. Nevertheless, the policy response to Ukraine was special and lethal. 7 crucial policies were applied only or mainly in Soviet Ukraine. I guess it's okay when BadEmpanada selectively avoids what is being said. I guess that's fine. Okay, so this whole argument that it's all collective farms just was thrown out the window, because this was clearly mainly or only towards Soviet Ukraine. So what now? With this added context.
Collective farms, it's all of them. In all collective farms in the Soviet Union, this was.
Someone has not read the Bloodlands, I see. Someone has not read the Bloodlands. Very, very disappointing development.
Was a requirement. And guess what? We actually have specific facts and figures that tell us how many farms ended up being blacklisted in the different regions of the Soviet Union. So let's look at the actual impact of Ukraine.
There we go. We're gonna see how many regions were blacklisted. Actually, I'm interested in that. So let's go. Let's go to the sources. Show us.
Of this blacklisting policy. And we can do this pretty easily because Anne Applebaum, who our friend here provingly cites later on as some sort of amazing authority on the famine, engaged in the same deception that Timothy Snyder did here by bringing up the blacklisting policy without mentioning the fact that it was Soviet Union-wide and without actually mentioning the fact that we have specific...
he says here that it's mainly or only towards Soviet Ukraine. So provide us with the wider context. I'm waiting. I'm excited. Show us.
Specific figures for how many farms were actually blacklisted in Ukraine.
Us.
That is...
Show us.
400 out of 23,000. So this was clearly nowhere near as impactful of a...
So when were the other ones?
Policy as Snyder, as Applebaum, or as this guy claims.
Wait, this doesn't prove that it was... Wait, this quotation does not prove that the blacklisting was Soviet-wide. This does not prove what you're trying to say. It only proves that the blacklisting was not super effective or well implemented, but it doesn't say that it was Soviet-wide and not targeted against Ukraine specifically.
Nor was it discriminatory, as they also like to imply. And do you know how Nor was it
What?
Discriminatory is impactful 100 out of 23,000. So
in Ukraine, Not in the Soviet Union. Also, there is some problem here. It don't matter which exact farms were blacklisted in comparison of productivity. Yeah. Like, I want to see the quote or the source that shows that it was a Soviet-wide policy. I want to see, can I see that, please?
This was clearly nowhere near as impactful of a policy as Snyder, as Applebaum, or as this guy claims.
Nobody said it was impactful, but it was still lethal.
Nor was it discriminatory, as they also like to imply.
It is. It targeted Ukraine, and you have not shown otherwise.
And do you know how we know
I don't know. I'm waiting. I'm excited to.
many collective farms ended up being blacklisted in Ukraine? Soviet archives. New evidence that came out after the theses from the 80s of genocide were formed that contradicted them.
Okay, now show me how many of them were blacklisted outside of Ukraine. And then it's a closed deal, right? It's a done deal. Now you just have to show me how many were blacklisted in total throughout the whole Soviet Union with a breakdown of regions, right? You're gonna do that right now, right? You're gonna provide that information, right? To sort of show us that the thing was Soviet-wide.
This is why it's very important to not just read books that rehash arguments from the 80s. This is why it's important to read new scholarship that argues against those theses based on new
Argues against feces.
information. Because one part of the genocide argument from the 80s, originally made by Robert Conquest, was this. There were farms that were blacklisted in Ukraine for not producing or giving enough grain, blah, blah, blah. Then the Soviet archives opened up. Historians were able to look at the information within them, and they were able to see that the blacklisting policy, for one, was actually not discriminatory against Ukrainians, and for two, it only affected a very small minority of farms anyway. And
So wait, you're not gonna provide me with the data that says how many farms outside of Ukraine were affected and which regions. So you have not demonstrated that it was a Soviet Union wide policy at all. You just said it and showed us quote that does not demonstrate that at all. Okay.
this is the only thing that this guy cites from Timothy Snyder's book. He's like, oh, I actually went and read this book. I don't believe
It's proof, trust me, bro.
read it all. I think you just went and looked for a specific part of it. And anyway, the reason I read this book, I don't believe this is the only thing that this guy cites from Timothy Snyder's book. He's like, oh, I actually went and read this book. I don't believe you read it all. I think you just went and looked for a specific part of it. And anyway,
I've quoted a lot more, so
the reason why I didn't respond to this specific part of this book is because I was not responding to this book. I was not engaging in a thorough debunking of this book. I explained why it was bad, and I
your reasoning is very poor. You have not even established your claim. Yeah, even it was small percent total. If they were 100% in Ukraine, then that is what matters. Yes. And yes, he did not compare other regions, but again, it matters to compare these blacklist collective farms in comparison of productivity to understand its effects in relation to hunger. Yeah. Of course. So in essence, he has not demonstrated anything amazing that would be established BadEmpanada claim to compare with other regions. Yeah. He would need to do that, yeah.
explained why I thought it wasn't a good inclusion in the Wikipedia article. Or I think actually I said, I can understand why it's in the Wikipedia article, though I don't think it's a very good source. Something like that. But
also, even if all other regions can also be targeted due genocidal, that is true. That is why I wanted a breakdown according to specific regions, because I wanted to know what regions were most affected.
I was responding to the Wikipedia article, right?
Because it's important, right?
I was explaining why this isn't a great
And then
source.
we would look into that specific, like, that would be the process, right? You would see what regions were affected by the blacklisting, in what amount. Then you'd look into the specific regions, who lived there, what general policy towards those people was, etc., etc. And then you could start figuring out what was going on there, right?
To be used and why its arguments aren't very good and how it has to.
Is there a reason why you don't link your white leaf site on Twitch and or YouTube? I only found it kind of by chance. Oh, I link it in the description of YouTube, in the YouTube video. I have to add it to the Twitch as well.
Dishonestly avoid the counter arguments in order to function at all, how it has to rehash arguments from the 80s while dishonestly presenting talking points exactly like this one, exactly like this blacklist talking point, which have since been thoroughly shown to really not have been nearly as impactful as they were previously said to be. So yeah, I believe the kids would call this one a huge L for my friend here.
Now, to BadEmpanada's credit, he does at least
How ironic, considering what we've just discussed here.
recognized that Stalin's policies were disastrous and that the actions within the Soviet government were irresponsible. And thus the fault for at least some of the deaths in the famine was indeed Stalin's fault. BadEmpanada is mainly just arguing against it
Bad at what?
being intentional. There are other tankies out there who are much more pro-Stalinist than him, that try to make absurd arguments that Stalin did nothing wrong and that the famine was caused entirely by disease or other natural causes, despite the lack of solid evidence for this claim, and in spite of all the research that has been done into Stalin's actions during this time period that heavily details all the terrible things that he did.
The thing is, there is actual solid evidence for the natural cause thesis. And you know that because I cited Mark B. Torger's work on the topic in my video. So, again, you're just ignoring the counter evidence and just confidently stating something with a smug tone, and apparently that's
Pot meat cattle?
supposed to
Pot
be a
meat
replacement
cattle.
for actual analysis of any type? Oof. Not leaving a good impression here, my friend.
So credit does have to be given to BadEmpanada for not being as crazy as some of the other tankies. But for the most part, all his video really boils down to is examining the sources used in the 2022 version of the Wikipedia article on the Holodomor genocide question, and pointing out how the sources that stand against the idea that the Holodomor was a genocide tend to have more effort behind them and be more fleshed out than the sources.
So we know that the Soviets extracted enough grain to feed the entire population that died 3 times over. Yeah, we know. We know that the crop was enough to feed the population. It was just taken away. So the cause of the deaths was not even the famine itself. It was the taking away of the food.
Sources claiming it was, and claiming that the latest research actually claims that it was not a genocide, based on Coruscant data from Soviet archives claiming it wasn't, and that all the sources claiming that it was a genocide are supposedly based on outdated information. In other words, it's an empiricist analysis with almost no rationality applied to it.
So he just kind of came out and said right there that he thinks that he can just sort of avoid evidence and, like, argue for what he believes based on nothing but his own epic rationale.
And we can come to that conclusion, by the way, through the archives.
Rational brain. I don't think that's how this works. You kind of do need to analyze the evidence, and I can guarantee you, my friend, that a lot of rational thinking
Still
goes
friends.
into this analysis of the evidence. But I haven't really seen a lot of rational thinking from you, given the fact that the very first thing you did was kind of mischaracterize and argue against a guy who agrees with you. Not to mention that you're here talking about more recent scholarship and all of this stuff. I cited like 6 or 7 different more recent works in my video. You're just ignoring them and you're being like, hey, well, what about this other book by Anne Applebaum?
Now, aside from the rational problems I pointed out, there's an additional
This is why him saying we're the blacklisted collective farms makes it difficult to agree with him.
problem with this, which is that there actually are books out there that take a closer look at the evidence and conclude it was a genocide that are relatively recent. For instance, one of the sources for my video that you're watching right now is the book Red Famine by Anne Applebaum in 2017, which heavily documents how the genocide was carried out, why it was carried out, and how Soviet propaganda mills covered it up.
Well, let's talk about Anne Applebaum. Anne Applebaum is not
Oh
a
no, damn. Wait, you're not a historian, BadEmpanada. That is not an argument you can use by any stretch. That is not an argument you can use. Come on, drop that argument. Drop it. Drop it like a bad dream. Stop it. Stop with that argument, or else I will punish you.
Historian. Anne Applebaum is a journalist. What is her book? It's a rehash of Robert Conquest, the same Robert Conquest who has since disavowed his previous arguments after seeing new information. There is a really good article by an actual real historian, one who, as I went over in my original video, I don't particularly agree with, but he is very much an expert on this subject matter. He's very familiar with the sources, he's very familiar with the other scholarship, so his assessment of her work is extremely good and extremely valuable. But don't take my word for it, you can read his article yourself.
Whose? Mark Tauger. Should we read it?
Mark B. Torger wrote an extremely good critique of Anne Applebaum's absolutely horrible book, which is not a scholarly work. It's, as I said earlier about Bloodlands, it's way worse than Bloodlands, by the way. It specifically avoids the actual more recent scholarship on the matter while citing the recent scholarship on the matter when it's convenient for her. It ignores their arguments, it ignores the counter-arguments, it ignores the counter-evidence,
But you did the same in this response here.
evidence that her citations show that she knows exists to essentially make a politically motivated polemic argument. And that is why it is a terrible source. And this is essentially the argument, though in much more detail.
Says, first of all, BadEmpanada, the non-historian. Like,
with specific...
I mean, the Soviet archives were not the only archives that had evidence of the Holodomor. True.
Very specific examples, dozens of them, that Mark B. Torger
I mean, keep in mind, and last time I mentioned this, BadEmpanada mocked me, but Western Ukraine wasn't Poland then. Poland had spies within the Soviet Union. Poland did correspondence with the Soviet Union. There are sources in Poland itself as well, for the Holodomor.
To essentially completely rubbish and destroy this book. I could just sort of read this whole thing in full, but it's quite long, so I will link it in the description so you guys can go and read it yourself. One specifically relevant part that is relevant to the thing that we just talked about with the blacklisting of collective farms is this part here, where Torger says, Applebaum describes the blacklisting policy, which denied a kolkhoz or village access to trade, forced them to pay debts early, and sometimes seize other possessions as a main cause of the famine. Yet her own sources show that in December, at the peak of the campaign, only 400 kolkhozy were blacklisted. Her sources agree that blacklisting could not and did not stop trade. The Ukrainian government also removed villages from the blacklist if they met most of the procurement quota. Applebaum never mentions these points. Based on this evidence, it is difficult to accept Applebaum's claims that blacklisting was a major cause of famine mortality. So this is another example of how people who argue for the genocide thesis tend to ignore or play up things like this. Obviously, when only 400 collective farms were blacklisted out of 23,000 in Ukraine total, we're not talking about a measure that specifically targeted Ukrainians, nor are we talking about a measure that could have possibly on its own been a cause of the famine. Was it unjust or bad or whatever? Maybe, sure. But is it evidence of some intentional genocide targeted at Ukrainians? Certainly not. In fact, this wider context that shows that only about 3% of the collective farms ended up being blacklisted in Ukraine shows that it was quite a selective measure, one that is clearly being played up to be far more bigger and impactful and targeted than it really was by people who nonetheless have clearly read these sources, they've seen these numbers, yet have nonetheless decided to dishonestly present this information by removing this context in their own work. such as Anne Applebaum, such as Timothy Snyder, who did the exact same thing in the passage that my friend here cited to supposedly debunk me.
Interestingly, this one is completely missing from the Wikipedia article. It's almost as if Wikipedia's source requirements are actually biased against more right-leaning sources. Nah, that couldn't be. So I guess in a fun M. Night Shyamalan twist, he's entirely correct that the Wikipedia article on the Holodomor genocide is biased, just for the opposite reason he seems to think that it is.
The reason why Anne Applebaum's book isn't on the Wikipedia page, at least I would hope, is because she's not an academic. It would make no sense to include a polemic by a journalist that is clearly very shoddy scholarship, as that bit that I just went over alone shows, but as Mark B. Torger shows very thoroughly in his review, in an article summarizing academic opinions on the matter. And buddy, if you think the New York Times is left-wing, I don't even know what to say to you. You've got some problems going on there in the brain of yours. So that's the end of the part of his video that deals with my... with my video. His video is less than half of the duration of mine, and the part of his video that specifically deals with my video is 10 minutes long. My video is more than an hour, by the way. So very clearly doing what he accused me of doing, I was clearly the one who was being thorough here, while he was being incredibly cherry-picky and completely ignoring all of the work of the scholars that I brought up, that I summarized, that very inconveniently contradict the narrative that he wants to push here. And I mean, half of those 10 minutes is dedicated to him debunking.
I don't even know what... There's nothing else to add here. That's it, I guess.
A position that I never expressed, and the person whose opinion that I was summarizing, Michael Ellman, certainly never expressed either. So we're not exactly dealing with the best of the best here, though. Perhaps on YouTube, this is what counts for some sort of like knowledge lord, who undoubtedly has an adoring fan base who considers him to be some sort of intellectual. Look, I'm sorry for the tone that I took in this video. I might be a bit dismissive, I might be a bit of an asshole, but honestly, I have no patience for people who seem to think that just by putting on a smug voice and putting memes on the screen while completely ignoring all of the contradictory information that the video that you purport to be responding to set forth, that it makes you some sort of intellectual or whatever, that it
Puddle meat. Cat meat. Oh, pot meat cattle. Pot meat cattle.
makes you like some sort of enlightened being.
Jesus.
YouTube history just sucks, man. People who claim to be doing history on YouTube suck. People who claim to be doing politics on YouTube suck. If this is the best you guys have got, if this is the best response that you can do, yeah, just keep it to yourselves next time, please. I think this is so bad that it warrants me just plain being mean. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. It's too bad. I just wanted to make a quick response to this because I'm so excited to have someone respond to me. But I think in the end, just ended up being frustrating. Not because like he totally owed me or anything, just because it's disappointing. Disappointing that this is really the best that they've got against me. This is the best you can throw at me. He spent 5 minutes of the video arguing, like mischaracterizing the argument of a guy who agrees with him. And then the rest of the video was him just talking about how great Timothy Snyder and Anne Applebaum are without actually dealing with my argument as to why they aren't particularly great. Like, he didn't respond to me directly. No, he didn't respond to me directly. He didn't respond directly to a single thing that I said, even once, aside from the bit about Australia, which was him just completely misunderstanding what I was even saying. So, yeah. Whew. Anyway, see ya.
See you.